Hello, dear students. So we're going to take a look at Chapter 4 of Consuming Choices. After the very sort of tortuous twists and turns of Chapter 3, trying to figure out different ways to make the concept of causality work as an explanation for the moral wrongdoing that attaches to our consumer purchases, Schwartz turns in Chapter 4 to a completely different kind of explanation, right? A different line of moral reasoning that begins with a different moral concept. And in this case, the basic idea is that even if my buying something does not clearly cause the moral wrongdoings that I might be concerned about in relation to the product, my participating in the sort of grand scheme of things in which these moral wrongdoings occur might itself be enough to explain exactly how my just buying something or using something connects up with that moral wrongdoing. And the structure for this presentation will be just a trip through the reading questions for this week. So hopefully that would be helpful as a way for you to check your own critical reading, see if you're finding the right passages as you're looking at the questions, and maybe some explanations that will help you as you're developing your answers for the quiz. So the first reading question is, what is the fundamental concern of those who reject consequentialist reasoning generally? So after reading chapter 3, you, or many other people, may find that they're dissatisfied with various aspects of those explanations. That's a sort of particular concern. For some of us, we may find that we just don't think that that kind of moral reasoning as a type is the right kind of moral reasoning. And so if you look at page 89, right at the first page of chapter 4, I'm using the second edition, so if you're using the first edition online, your page numbers are going to be slightly different. But if you look on page 89, the key quote here is, "These criticisms reflect a fundamental concern that consequentialist theory simply fails to capture an essential element of moral life, namely that some actions are wrong in principle rather than for their consequences." So one reason to look into complicit participation, the moral concept of chapter 4, is that you might think consequentialism as such just doesn't work. If consequentialism is right, then an action is good or bad or right or wrong depending on its consequences, depending on the results, or depending on what sort of results one can expect. We talked a little bit about rule consequentialism in chapter 3. But you might think that some actions are wrong, period. Like even if they didn't have bad results, even if they had good results, you might think there's some things that you just shouldn't do. You might think there's some things that in fact turn out to have bad results, but we don't really have to know that in order to know that those things are wrong. Some things are wrong in principle. If that sounds right to you, you may be dissatisfied with consequentialism, and that would be one reason for you to think that you might want to look into this complicit participation kind of moral concept that chapter 4 is dedicated to. So the second reading question, how does Kutz's complicity principle help to explain the collective action in the Dresden firebombing? So we've used this example. So many fire bombers dropped so many bombs on Dresden that it's really hard to say that any particular fighter pilot did anything causally to the destruction in Dresden, because it was just so overdetermined. There were so many bombs falling all at once. It would be impossible to say, well, this fighter pilot's bomb, caused the destruction and this one came too late. So it'd be really hard to figure out a causality element here. I mean, obviously, if no one had dropped a bomb, then Dresden wouldn't have been destroyed. So the key quotation here is on page 91. Even granting that no single bomber pilot made a difference to the harmful outcome, all who participated are implicated because they each intentionally and willingly participated in the firebombing effort. And so Kutz's complicity principle, which I'll read, this is also on page 91. I am accountable for what others do when I intentionally participate in the wrong they do or harm they cause. I am accountable for the harm or wrong we do together, independently of the actual difference I make. So it's a move from causality to intention. And so you get this intentionally and willingly participated as being the really key element in how Kutz's complicity principle would apply in this situation. So intention becomes the direct link. Even if the harm doesn't clearly result from my individual action, I'm part of the group through my intentional participation. And so being part of the group through my intentional participation makes me also accountable or responsible for the results. And so even if I didn't cause the results, I can be responsible for the results based on being part of the group. How do I become part of the group? Through intentional participation. Of course, we've got to figure out what intention means in this case, and part of chapter 4 is dedicated to that as well, but that's the general idea. So then Kutz talks a lot about structured collectives. So one of the ways of trying to explain how intentional participation works and try to account for various intuitions that we might have that some people in the group are more responsible than other people in the group. There's a lot of discussion about that. But then we come to this discussion of unstructured collectives. This is on page 97. Key quote is, in contrast to structured collectives, unstructured collective actions lack both a collective decision rule, so that's one thing, and an intentional unity of purpose among participants. So there's these two things that define what a structured collective looks like. And so if you have an unstructured collective action, it's missing these two things. There's not a collective decision rule, and there's not an intentional unity of purpose. Some groups, this is how I like to think about it, some groups are less like teams and more like mobs, but you can still be caught up in the mob and you can still be responsible for what results from that mob action. Facebook groups, right? If you've been part of any Facebook groups, those can get kind of weird. And so some things that occur there are not necessarily determined through any sort of rule that actually guides the group or any kind of unity in what people are doing. So the question is, how do we determine individual responsibility when thinking about these more amorphous groups? That's part of what the discussion immediately following on chapter 97, on page 97, is supposed to help us out with. So we mentioned the complicity principle. Schwartz then in section 3, so starting on page 101 in the second edition, but it's where section 3 shows up. Schwartz says there should be a modification made to Kutz's version. And the reading question is, how does Schwartz's modified complicity argument respond to cases like buying slave-made clothing? How is this different than Kutz's version of the argument? So if Schwartz is doing a modified version, in what way is it similar to Kutz's? How is it different? How would it apply in a particular situation, let's say buying slave-made clothing? So we have this key quote on page 102. Schwartz is talking in the first person here. My modified argument departs from Kutz's in being more straightforwardly Kantian. The wrongness of my buying slave-made clothing resides in my principled treatment of these workers as a mere means for satisfying my desires. So the key concept here is that in principle, when I'm buying, say, slave-made clothing, in principle, my choice is such that it treats people as a mere means. And one of the formulations of the categorical imperative for Kant, one way of thinking about the categorical imperative, is that you have to always treat people as an end in themselves and not merely as a means. So if you are treating them merely as a means, that's enough to make it clear that what you're doing is wrong. Quite apart from any results, just the principle of the thing. If you're treating people merely as some means to your own ends rather than treating them as ends in themselves, that's enough to show why it's wrong. So Kutz emphasizes structure as a way of determining responsibility, right? And you get those core agents versus those peripheral agents. And so you can say some people are more responsible if they're towards the core, and other people are less responsible if they're more on the periphery in the group. In contrast to this, Schwartz thinks we can locate the responsibility in an individual's own attitudes. So you don't have to think about where they're at in the group. You can just think about why is the person doing what they're doing. If I'm willing to use people, to put it in that kind of language, then that really gets to the heart of the matter, and that's enough to say that what I'm doing is clearly morally wrong. So the next reading question asks why, according to Schwartz, should we think that consumer purchases do constitute core agency? So putting it in Kutz's terms, Schwartz says, you know what, consumers aren't really on the periphery of this. You can't think about it as, well, the companies who produce these goods and market and sell them, they're the core, and I'm more on the periphery as a consumer, and so I'm less responsible as a consumer. Schwartz thinks there's actually really good reason to place ourselves as consumers at the core of the group, to say that what we're doing is clearly essential to the wrongdoing that occurs. So the key quote is on page 103. Unlike the janitor, in like the bomb making factory, unlike the janitor, my purchase is essential to the successful collective activity of garment manufacture, marketing, and sales. So still talking about things like slave-made clothing. In fact, consumer participation is the primary motivation and sole criterion of success for the entire effort. So that's two things there, right? So the primary motivation for everything that's going on in the garment industry comes back to consumer participation. And the criterion of success, and Schwartz says sole criterion of success, that comes back as well to consumer participation. Why does Schwartz think this is true? The whole point is that they want you to buy stuff, right? Presumably these companies would not source the materials and source the labor, in this case slave labor or otherwise dangerous or undercompensated labor. They presumably wouldn't do all that and market it and sell it if people weren't buying it, right? If there was not going to be any end result of there being a consumer, presumably the whole thing would go away if there were no one buying it. So if you're buying stuff, you're playing the game. And Schwartz thinks that's enough to place us in the core of the collective action, where the collective action is this whole mess of everybody involved in the whole thing for the manufacturing and marketing and selling, and then me buying and then me using, and everything that happens related to that. This whole really complex web that we looked at in chapter 2 and has continued to show up for us throughout chapter 3 and chapter 4. It comes down to none of this would exist if there wasn't such a thing as a consumer. So if I'm a consumer, then I'm part of the game. I'm a part of the game in an essential capacity. I'm not just someone who happens to buy something. I'm really the whole point of the whole thing if I'm buying stuff. And so Schwartz thinks that's enough to not just say that what I'm doing when I'm buying something is a little bit wrong, but to say that it really is an essential component of the wrongdoing. And so then if I'm an intentional and willing participant in this essential role, then that places quite a moral burden on me. So those are the 5 reading questions for this week. I've pointed out where the key quotations are so that when you're preparing your quiz, you know where you should be looking, and you can work on trying to explain those. I would say for your quiz, you don't need to copy over those full quotations, right? So try to give an accurate paraphrase and then give your own explanation would be the way to work on answering those quiz questions.